All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. You're listening to ICSIA Talks episode 15, Benefits and Challenges for Technical Writers in an Agile World. I'm Sydney Jones, your host and Head of Marketing Communications here at ICSIAsoft. ICSIA Talks is a webinar series that covers DITA, Agile Document Management, localization, ICSIAsoft's very own CCMS, and more. Episodes are released periodically and cover a wide range of topics in the TechCom industry. Before we get started, there are a few things that you should know. First off, this presentation is being recorded, and we will be sending you a link to the recorded version an hour or two after it airs, so you can share it with colleagues who aren't able to make it. If you would like to ask a question during the webinar, we encourage you to type this into the questions section of your control panel at any point during the presentation. And at the end, Marian and I will answer these during the Q&A session. Now, onto the show. Waiting in the wings, we have our guest today, Marian Knebel, Senior Technical Communicator at Parson AG. And Marian is tuning in from Berlin, I believe. So Marian, welcome to ICSIA Talks.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here.
You are indeed tuning in from Berlin, right?
That's right. It's I'm in Berlin. It's summer and it's raining outside, so it's great to be in the webinar.
Okay, good. So before we get into today's topic, Marian, I'll let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Right. Okay, thank you. So my name is Marian Knebel. I work for a team of technical writers and consultants in Germany. Most of our customers are in the software industry, so we have a lot of contact with companies that work with Agile. But actually, I got trained in Agile methodologies even earlier in my last job, where I worked for a software company in Hamburg, Germany. And while I was there, we introduced Agile into the whole engineering department. And that was great because that meant a lot of training and experience for us. And I was even able to certify as a Scrum Master. So ever since then, I have kind of had a focus on Agile things. Okay. So this is the agenda for today. I would like to start with an introduction into what is Agile, what does it all mean, what are the basics, and then go into challenges for technical writers. Let's talk about what can possibly go wrong when you work as a technical writer in the Agile world. And lastly, I'd like to finish with some additional recommendations and ideas, what you can do. And then we have the Q&A session. So before we start, I'd like to do a little poll to figure out what everyone already knows about Agile. So Sydney, could you please launch the poll?
Yes, so you should all be able to see the poll, and it would be great if you could provide some input. We'll give you a couple seconds here.
Right. So we'd just like to know, how much experience do you have with Agile, whether you've worked with Agile in the past or even working right now on Agile teams, or whether you only know about it in theory, or if you don't know anything or very little.
All right, so a couple more seconds here, and then we'll shut it down. Okay. So Marian, I'll share the results with you now.
Okay, so that's great. So we have over 2/3 that are already working with Agile teams, but we still have quite a high number that only know a bit about Agile. So I think it's a good idea to go into the basics first and give you a bit of background. Okay. So let me start off with a tiny bit of history. Agile came into being more or less in the year 2001. When a bunch of 17 experts in software development came together to talk about what went wrong in the past and how things could be improved. Before that, in the 1990s, projects were always huge monsters where everyone would start to plan everything in the beginning, then develop everything, test everything, and in the end, come up with a great product. And that never worked. Projects were always late, never in budget. There were tons of documentation and not always a product that would fulfill the requirements. So they said, we have to do this really better. We have to come up with a way that is minimalistic, that is lean and agile, and change the way that we develop software completely. As a result, they published something called the Agile Manifesto, which has as a core these principles that you see here. And basically what they emphasize is that, individuals and people working together on the teams, but also with the customer, and, talking things over, reviewing stuff, changing stuff is so much more important than adhering to a fixed process, than, using a tool that might not fit in my workflow, and sticking to a contract that is out of date once I started working. So, it was all supposed to be very fluid and very much focused on the persons that are developing the software rather than the whole setup. One thing, though, that caused big misunderstandings from time to time is the second item, where they say working software is much more important than comprehensive documentation. Now, this has been understood by many people to say that, okay, that's great. We don't have to write any documentation any longer. And for those of you that work with software developers, you will know that software developers often hate to write documentation. It starts with the code documentation, but also with specifications and giving input to technical writers. And so this is often seen as an excuse, but it's actually wrong. It just means there shouldn't be, documentation shouldn't be more important than software. What it means is that documentation should always be relevant, to the point, and written for the target audience. And that includes all kinds of documentation, starting from the technical stuff and ending with the end user documentation. Okay. So this Agile Manifesto, as a result, has a few principles that are applied in all sorts of Agile setups. One is incremental development. So you have a set of requirements in the beginning, very much top-level requirements, where you don't go into any of the details, but it's just a list of prioritized things that should end up in the software that you're trying to develop. And then, rather than doing all the developing first and then all the testing and so on, the idea is you have like smaller time periods called sprints or iterations, where you do developing, testing, reviewing, and documenting of a feature. And then this period finishes, and ideally at the end of this period, everything that was started at the beginning of the sprint should be done and should be finished and ready to ship out to the customer. And then the next cycle starts, and the next, and the next, and the next, until you either run out of time, out of budget, or out of things to do that you want to accomplish with your software. And ideally, at any stage between these iterations, you should be able to ship a product. And progress is always measured in terms of functioning software. Okay. Now, the team is something that is really important in Agile, and it's at the core of everything. The team is a group of cross-functional people, it's a cross-functional team with members of different departments. There's developers in there, there's probably product people in there, there's testers, there's QA, there's technical writers on the team, UI designers, whatever you need to finish a certain task. So everything here is about cooperation and communication between these team members, and they organize themselves. They decide how much work they can do in one sprint, and then they take ownership of that and become responsible for finishing the task. And that's very important, and it's really the basis of everything, that the team as a group commits to finishing something. And if documentation is part of a feature, that also means that the team is responsible for getting that documentation done. So let's keep that in mind for everything that we'll hear in the next 30 minutes. Okay. Next one thing that is really important is transparency. You don't want to be hiding stuff. You want to be able to, at all times, see where is my team standing, where is my own work standing, but also where is the project standing, what is in progress, what is going on, how much is still left to do, how much have we got done. That way, you can always, make analyze, how far have you gotten, how much can be done in the next month, and do some prognosis on how much can be achieved overall. It's a great tool of measurement also for the guys that make the decisions and prioritize the user stories, but it's also a great tool for everyone, him or herself, because you always know what is going on around you, but also you can always let other people know what is going on with your work. And if someone else comes up to you and tells you, here I have another important task, it has nothing to do with your other work, but I need it done immediately, you can always go and say, well, okay, here's my task board, here's my tasks, they're all top priority. Please tell me the priority of your task, and then we'll see whether it's more important than the rest of the stuff. And because something else has to go, I'm already at 100%. So transparency can be achieved in with any tool. It doesn't really matter. Often people will use ticket systems like Jira or something else. But also sometimes people prefer to work with like real boards and real post-its or cards that they stick to a board and come together every day, look at the board, move some of the cards, or even have that and synchronize it with a digital version. So that, together with a continuous feedback and change, means that you have a great overview of what is going on. And sometimes things are even moved back in those columns because you realize in the end, oh no, the design wasn't as good, it was tested, but now we figured out something is not working. So continuous feedback and change is worked into this, and it's also very important because you can never be sure that something is really done. I mean, ideally it should be done if you carefully thought about it, but it can always happen that you have to go back and change something. And in Agile, we accept that as a normal way of things, and it's not something that is an error, is going wrong, but it's just normal that there's change. Okay. So what does the process look like? This here is the process as defined more or less in Scrum. Scrum is just one of several Agile methodologies, but I picked it here because it's the one that is most commonly employed, and many people are already familiar with it. So in the beginning, at the left, we have our product backlog. That's our list of requirements. It's just top level requirements. It's not about how do I implement something, but it's more like, what do my users want? What is it that the users want to achieve? So the little guy there at the bottom left, that's the product owner. And he's the one who doesn't even have to be a technical guy. He's the one who has the user vision and knows what the customer wants. If the customer can be your own company, or it can be someone else who gave you the task to develop the software, and he's the one who prioritizes the user stories and works together with the teams to figure out which ones they should work on next. Often they are from departments like product management, but they can also be from marketing, or they can be technical people. It doesn't really matter. It's just important that they have this dedicated role, and they hand out the priorities, and also in the end, they have the say whether a user story is really done, whether it's accepted, and whether it's finished. So in the beginning, there are epics. Those are like really big stories, the grand thing, which is what a really big feature, and then they're broken down into smaller parts called user stories that are then go into the development teams, and they're small enough so that they can be finished within one sprint. So when the sprint starts, the team comes together. There's the product owner, there's the rest of the team, and there's also a third guy, and that's the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is also a very important supportive role, because the Scrum Master doesn't really participate in the developing itself. Scrum Master can also be a technical person, can also be someone else. It doesn't really matter, because the Scrum Master will help the team to fulfill their goal, and he will be there to remove obstacles, to organize meetings, to make sure people stay on track, to make sure that all the acceptance criteria for a story are met, and so he just makes sure that everything is running smoothly. And I just talked about acceptance criteria. So there's this yellow post-it which says DOD, which stands for definition of done. And that's a really important tool in Scrum, because that's a list of must-haves, list of acceptance criteria for each story. So for example, for the story, as a user, I want to be able to mute myself. There have to be, these things have to be ticked off. The story, this feature has to be specified, it has to be implemented, there have to be test cases, and it has to be tested, and it has to be documented. So as a technical writer, if you can, you really want to make sure that document is on this list of things that need to be done for a story. So in the sprint planning now, the team decides, we can do, I don't know, maybe 3 stories in a sprint. The sprint can be from 1 week to 4 weeks or even longer, but I think the most common ones that I've heard are 2 to 3 weeks. One depends on the type of project that can be common. If it's longer than 4 weeks, then it starts to lose a bit of its agility. Anyway, so ideally, at the end of the sprint, all the cards will be on the right-hand side in the column done, and everyone is happy. To achieve that, during the sprint, there are a few regular meetings. The one at the top is the daily Scrum or the daily stand-up, which, despite its name, doesn't have to be always dailies, but it means the team comes together to discuss what went well, what didn't go great, today and yesterday, and who needs what from whom. So it's just their regular organizational meetings. And then towards the end of the sprint, we have the sprint review and the retrospective, where the sprint review is really a demo where everyone gets to see the new feature and gets to give feedback, even though they are not on the team. So sprint review can be with the whole development engineering department. It can be with everyone from the company. The customers can be involved. It really depends on your culture and your project. Often they are recorded so that people can watch them later. So this is really about figuring out what happened and what's the result. Whereas the retrospective is a completely different meaning, and that's really about coming together, looking at how did we work, what went good, what didn't go great, and where do we have to take action. So you really take a look at the time back at the last sprint, maybe the last 2 weeks, and if you figured something really didn't go great, then you would try to find an action, to determine an action so that this problem won't happen in the future, and so you can continually improve your way of working. And even if you're not in Agile at all, I recommend this as a great tool for any kind of working. We do retrospectives with our projects regularly at our company, and we do those with our customers, and that works really great. So our sprint is now done, and the result of the sprint is a piece of functioning software called a product increment. And as I said before, ideally, we should be able to ship it out into the world, even though that's not true at the beginning of a software development project where you have to focus on the basics first. But at later stages, you should at any time be able to say, okay, we can ship it now. Okay. So this was a short overview of what Agile and Scrum is all about. So let's take a look of what can possibly go wrong. But before we do that, we have one other poll, which Sydney is bringing up in the moment, because I would like to ask you to rate your experience with Agile. 5 meaning that you really love it, it's great, and you love working with it, and 1 meaning you hate it and it doesn't work for you at all. And why you do that, the reason that I'm asking this is that, my first experience with Agile was really great. And as a technical writing team at my last company, we really profited from this. And then I gave a similar presentation to this one for a group of technical writers in southern Germany. And I fully expected them to say, yeah, we all love Agile. And I asked them, who loves Agile? And no one raised their hand. There was a group of 40 people and they all hated Agile. And that's when it dawned on me that, it's not always going great. So
we'll just wait a few more seconds here. Waiting for a couple more votes to come in. Okay. So Marian, I'll send you over the results here.
Okay. So that's at least great. We only have very few in the I hate Agile corner. We have a large chunk in the middle that are probably either undecided or see some good stuff, but also see some disadvantages in Agile. And so that's 45% in the 4 to 5 range. So I'm quite relieved. That's a different result to the one I got the last time. Thank you. So anyway, so what can possibly go wrong? I kind of tried to put together a list of, the top reasons that why technical writers are frustrated, and I kind of highlighted the ones that we maybe hear most commonly. So we will go into these in detail now to figure out, with the different aspects where things are go wrong. So one side is the input side, where you are there, you are as the technical writer, but you just don't get the input. You don't have any written information. There's no specification, and no one tells you anything, and you're still expected to write some documentation. So that can be a huge challenge. Next one is obviously time, where you have lots of meetings and you might have multiple teams and you have to go from A to B and you have to do so much work and you never know when to finish it on time. And there's always so much more to do. Of course, the developers also can create problems for you by not, by coding until the last minute, and then you don't have any days left at the end of the sprint to finish your task. Okay, so let's look at the individual aspects. So first of all, input challenges. As I said, there's often not a written specification at all. Developers, if you're lucky, they write something down for you in the feature stories, but if you're unlucky, they don't. So a good place to start is at the backlog, at the level of the user stories and the epics, because that's where everything is written down from a user perspective already. And that's a great help for your documentation. So for me, a good user story would be, as a user, I want to be able to mute myself so that other meeting participants do not hear my background noises. So that gives me the thing that the user wants to do, also the why he wants to do it, but not the how, because we don't care about the how right now. From this, as a technical writer, you might be able to already derive a topic for your documentation, for example, how to mute yourself. On the other hand, what wouldn't be so great would be if it read, as a user, I want a mute button in the meeting settings section, because that would mean the product owner or whoever wrote the user story was already looking about technical implementation and not caring about the motivation of the user at all. Because no user really wants a mute button, they just want to be able to mute themselves, and then they want to have a great way of doing that, but they don't have a specific method usually for those kind of things. So user stories are the place to start, and that's also why, as a technical writer, you're a great person to help with those, because you already know how to think like a user, because we do that every day in writing documentation. And so we can really support the product owner and the team in writing good user stories. The next thing that can help you to get good input is to encourage your team to use some kind of sketches, wireframes, any form of mock-up that gives you an idea of what they want to do with their feature and what it looks like, because then you might be able to start to write ahead. And developers don't like to don't like to write, but they sometimes like to draw, and they draw a lot on whiteboards and have their ideas in there, and they can take photos and maybe just put those in there. But at least you would have some kind of input if they don't want to write it down for you. Now, the definition I've done already, I can't say that often enough. Documentation has to be mandatory on the definition of done in some form or the other. Now, it's still unrealistic in many cases that you would be able, as a technical writer, if it's about end user documentation, to really finish the end user documentation in the same sprint as the developers do the coding, because you will have very little time left at the end. So one idea to solve this problem is that instead of saying, okay, we have to finish like the technical documentation written by the tech writers in that sprint, we change this to mean that the developers have to prepare documentation for technical writers. We call that a doc task. So it just means, there is some kind of documentation that's input for technical writers, also input for the product guys, for marketing, for everyone who needs information about that feature. And without doing this, no team can close a story. So that's something that, at least in my projects, worked quite well in the past. Okay. Next one is team meetings. As I said, there are like the dailies, and there are the other meetings. There might be additional meetings scheduled individually. And I think technical writers should be part of as many meetings as possible, because those are the places where, you don't sometimes get the written stuff, but you get the details in there. You can provide feedback to the developers, because as a technical writer, you're really good first-time user, and you can tell them what works and what doesn't. And you can ask questions, and you always know who the people are that you need to talk to if you talk with them in the meetings. And also, you can use those meetings to schedule your interviews that you need to additionally have with engineers, also maybe with the product owners, with QA, marketing, whoever is a stakeholder in your story and has important information for you. I know interviews are nothing particularly agile. We do that in every kind of technical documentation project, but they can be even more important here. Then sprint reviews are a good place to be to figure out how features work, especially if you don't have access to working software during your work. Sometimes that's not possible because it's, I don't know, you need hardware for it, or for security reasons or whatever. So if you don't have access to the software, then go to the sprint reviews, and if there's videos of those demos, then that's great input, because you will see people actually using the features, and that helps you write documentation. And lastly, that's something that's probably not happening everywhere, but usability tests are sometimes done with external companies, where you would take a piece of software and give any person from the street, or a person of a particular target audience, a task and maybe some documentation, and observe how they use the software. So if you have time and you want to figure out how users use your software and how you can improve your documentation based on that, then it's if you have the opportunity, it's great to participate in that and observe how people use the software. Maybe you can even include your documentation in those sessions, and that way figure out whether the documentation works. Or another idea is, if you want to do more low budget usability tests in your company, then you could offer to be a test person yourself, which can be quite interesting. Okay. So next one, we talked about input and where does the input come from. The other next aspect is time. And yeah, I don't know, probably many of you know this problem, that the engineers like to code until the last day of the sprint, regardless whether QA can't do any testing, and technical writers can't do any documentation. So ideally, at least if the sprint is longer than a week, then engineers should not code on the last days of the sprint. The longer the sprint, the more days they shouldn't code. Also, they shouldn't be sitting around, but they can use that time to do code refactoring, to giving input to QA and technical documentation, to review stuff, maybe to redo stuff because Q&A might find some errors somewhere, so they can work on that and generally improve quality and help the team, the rest of the team, achieve their tasks, because we should never forget that the whole team is responsible for getting stuff done. Another thing that you can try is to really start writing ahead or parallel to implementation. But I often find it only works if you have like really reliable specifications, often including pictures. If UI design is really included right from the beginning and not done as an afterthought, because then you have a problem, because in your end user documentation, at least, you have to rely on the user interface layout a lot. But if you have a team that works this way, that really does great specifications up front, then why not start writing ahead? And then you may need to make some adjustments later, but maybe not too many. If none of that really works, and you need to find some extra time somewhere else, then it could also be an idea to say, well, okay, I really can't publish a new manual each sprint. It's too much, because there's also, still publishing work to be done. There's layouting, I don't know what other stuff, and we can't do the whole quality, the whole peer reviews in that time. So you might want to commit to, well, we publish documentation every, I don't know, third sprint or so. If that is accepted by your company, that can be a way to reduce some of the pressure. And lastly, you need, if you are still working in like tools like Word or Unstructured FrameMaker that is not greatly modularized, and where you still need to do a lot of manual tasks for publishing, then you really need to optimize your infrastructure, and I have some recommendations for that later on. Okay. So when is a good time to start? We get asked this often, you always, if you start right at the beginning when the developers do something, as I said, if they don't do like great specifications up front, then if you start immediately, you might have to change things a lot of times, and it's just too early. But it's still too late, to wait a very long time. And the reasons are here because ideally, if we look at what Agile means at the core, we should be able to finish documentation in the same sprint because it's part of the product, and we want to be able to ship it then. But as a good practice, what worked in my company and in other companies before is to start writing the document, or to write the documentation one sprint later. By that time, the developers are probably all still working kind of on the same topics. They know what they did and what is important, and it's still a good way to do this. What may work is to wait even a bit longer and wait until everything is really stable and you have a few more features that together make up a whole set of features that you can describe. And that way, it might make sense to wait a bit longer. Just know that you will have less costs for rewrites and probably less frustration because everything is more ready. But the more time you wait, the higher the risk that you have some out-of-date documentation in between, and that your SME, your subject matter expert, is not available anymore because either he's working on other stuff and doesn't remember anything, or he's probably even working on a different team and you don't have access anymore. So I really don't recommend the red one. So don't wait until you have feature complete of everything, because by that time, you don't get any inputs, no one remembers anything, and you have very little time to finish your documentation. Okay. So the next one is also a bit about time. We already said, there's meetings. If as a technical writer, you probably have not just one Scrum team, you have a few of those, and sometimes many. So if you go to all the meetings, you have a lot of meetings and you can't get any other work done. Also, you might probably have some tasks on your list that don't have anything to do with a Scrum, with the work for the Scrum task. You might, I don't know, care about translation, have your internal terminology circle and publishing tasks and whatnot. So other stuff that is not covered by Scrum teams. And so you have a lot of work on your plate. So what to do? Ideally, if you can, limit the number of teams that you work for. I know that once when I was in Denmark, a lady told me she had to work for 50 Scrum teams. So basically, she wasn't able to. So she had no access to anyone. She didn't go to any of the meetings. She couldn't even do any real technical writing. She could just edit a little what the developers wrote, and it was really horrible. So from my experience, depending on the size of the teams and the work they do, something like 2 to 3 teams can work. But if it's more, then you should really look at, if you can, reducing the number of teams. Even with that number of teams, you might have to prioritize and figure out which meetings are the ones where I get the most benefit from. So you might skip some of those daily stand-ups, but ideally you should try to make the sprint plannings, the demos, and the retrospectives, especially the retrospectives, because this is where you can go to tell the people what problems you have and what they can do to help you. And lastly, for the meetings that you skip, designate someone on the team, maybe the Scrum Master, because that fits his role quite well, as a proxy, so that he will be there, or he or she, to collect all the relevant input that is important for you if you cannot make it. And so they can write you some short notes and give you the input that you missed. Okay. So we are running out of time also in this presentation. I'll try to make it through. Just a quick note on teams. We talked about Scrum teams quite a bit, which are cross-functional teams dedicated to work on a task. On the other hand, there's also functional teams, or sometimes called horizontal and vertical teams. So a functional team is more like your group of technical writers, or your group of QA people, or user interface designers. And there it's not so much focused on one task, but on the same role, and exchanging information, doing peer reviews and that kind of stuff. So different teams have different ways of working together and different goals. So don't think you have to apply agile practices everywhere, but figure out what method works great for which kind of team. I think stuff like task boards still still are very useful for functional teams, but the question is then again, do I need like the same development sprints that I need for the Scrum teams? Does that even make sense? For sure, this does not make any sense. In the third group that I put here in Scrum, they're called communities of practice. So these can just be regular or irregular meetings of people with the same role in different teams, where they would, talk about giving each other advice, saying what problems they have, and basically helping each other out. So this can be Scrum Masters or data experts or XAirsoft experts. Okay. And you can be part of, any of these teams. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have been waiting for this. Translation is a big problem in Agile. Because getting the technical writing done is a problem, and getting the translation done is obviously something that needs to happen after the technical writing. And I would love to tell you that I have a really great solution for this, but I don't. So you have to cope some way to get the translation done. And one thing is for sure, you need modularized content as a requirement for iterative translation. Now, since most of you probably, or a lot of you might work with the XAirsoft CCMS, that's no problem. You have modular content there, and you also have workflows for translation. But still, and a few other things need to happen. You need to have your user interface localized before you go into translation. And you want to make sure that you have great quality in your writing and you have consistency. If you have terminology tools and language checkers, that's great. But without, it can be problematic to achieve this consistency across all the content if you're working in distributed teams. And also it's problematic for the translators if they just get like little bits of information of content to translate here and there. And from my experience, quality is better if they get more content at the same time. And also, if you have to rewrite constantly, and if you have to send out stuff again and again into translation, that exponentially increases translation costs, which no one really wants, especially if you have more than 2 or 3 languages. So as a workaround, you might consider to drop any requirement to finish translation at the same time as the source material, or you might even move translation completely out of the Agile process if that is an option, or at least to start a translation job, I would always wait until you have enough material available. Okay. So now a few final recommendations and ideas. Please continue. So I said the DoD is very important, and I can't say this often enough as well. Technical writers should always be part of Scrum teams. When I hear people complaining about how Agile is so really bad and they don't get any input and everything is really horrible, and I ask them, well, are you part of the team? And most of the time they say, no, I don't. I'm not allowed to. I can't. I don't want to. Different reasons. But it just doesn't work in Agile. Everyone should come together and work on things. So as a technical writer, you will get the input that you need from the team. You will know who to talk to, and you can always put pressure on the people to finally finish that review you asked them for, or to give you an interview. And the team also profits quite a lot from your presence, because you have this user-centric point of view as a technical writer. You know what users want and need. You know if something is a good piece of software or it isn't. If you probably experience this as well. If you write like a procedure and you find it really, really hard to write that procedure, then it's usually because there's something wrong in the software, because otherwise it should be easy to describe. And also the team would profit from your linguistic capabilities and your usability feedback. You can help them get the user interface strings right, and where to improve everything. So with time, if you have the problem that you're, as a technical writer, you're not viewed as an equal, then be bold, go to those, try to join the teams, and with time you learn to accept each other and treat as equals. At least that's my personal experience. Okay. So I promised you something about the infrastructure. It's not really that exciting. Most of it is pretty obvious. You need separation of layout and content, whether it be in the CCMS or whether you use XML or Markdown or whatever. But you really can't care anymore about like making things nice, fiddling around with page breaks and stuff like that. So you really, really need automated generation of output and version control and automatic builds into the system. You can either use the system, the CCMS, or if you don't, you can still use the same tools that the developers use. We do that in many projects. We have quite a few DITA-XML projects where we have the code together in the same repositories as the documentation, and we use the same build tools for documentation as well. Then for the reviews, I recommend to have a web-based review client for collaborative reviews. And then another thing is, if you have engineers that need to contribute directly, then you might want to consider Markdown as something because they hate XML. So last slide, just a few things on there, just an idea. If you can change the slide, Sydney, please. Okay. Slides not coming anyway. Here it is. So this is the idea that I want to give you. If sometimes you think, oh, I can be more something else than a technical writer, what could I be good at? You're really good communication experts and you understand the users, so you would also be perfect as Scrum Masters or product owners. So if you have the time, or if you want to change what you do, why not consider to fulfill those roles? Also, don't hesitate to be the usability expert on the team if you don't have a real usability expert, and yeah, be the linguistic expert, and for example, establish regular meetings to discuss user interface strings and to enforce quality control on those as early as possible. From my experience, when you do this for a while, eventually the developers will always come and ask you, oh, how should I write this error message? How should I do this and that? And they accept that you are the better expert in that than they are. So in essence, be bold. And thank you for listening to my presentation. And
Thanks, Marianne. That was super. We're going to move into our question section now. So I have noticed that a few of you have asked us questions. So we're going to start by dealing with these one by one. If we don't have time to get to all of them, we will absolutely send you a message afterwards and respond to these via email. So our first question for you, Marian, is Scrum board is totally owned by the development team. Rarely writers have their own story. Writers and tags for features or stories. Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, the question is why don't you? The question is, can you not create them yourselves, or is it just well, wouldn't they let you, or haven't you thought about doing your own stuff? So from my experience, there's two ways this can go. Either documentation is just part of the other stories, and the developers aren't allowed to finish their stories until documentation is built into that story, or you create a separate set of documentation stories that then are linked to the other stories and have a relationship of some kind. For example, like this is a prerequisite for the documentation story, and the documentation story is still blocked if the other stuff is not done, and still you would see the relationship. And I prefer it if the documentation stories are really part of the Scrum teams themselves, because that way it enforces that the whole team is responsible for doing stuff. Yeah, if that can't be done, then you're probably not where you as whole as a team where you should be, where they have accepted you as part of the team. And I then hope that some of the stuff I told you today can help you to make progress there.
Okay, thank you. So our next question is, do you have any advice for documenting hardware products in an agile environment? How do you manage the risk of documenting too early or too late in the project, depending on the number of concept/part iterations, which is somewhat unknown before more advanced prototypes are tested in later sprints?
Okay, so yeah, that's a problem because hardware doesn't have the whole iterative cycles as software does, because you can't test and with software it's always easy to test a feature. With hardware it's not. I don't really have any specific advice in the sense of, that's where you have to start, because all the companies are so different. I don't know. Indeed I wouldn't start too early, but maybe you can separate and start with doing like, coming up with the structures first, and setting up your documentation where that's the topics I have to write about, and that's how I put it together, and already make all the necessary preparations for that. I would do the images at the end, because you probably can't be sure that any of them are correct before. And then kind of fill your way around in between, but definitely don't wait until there's a finalized prototype. I would rather say start writing a bit earlier, and then factor in that you have to make changes later on. But because if you wait too late, as I said, then there's no time towards the end, and in the end you won't be able to do any quality control on your own work. If that's not at all possible, then of course you always have to be pragmatic. If none of that works for you, I don't know if there's a possibility and how much time you have left at the end. If you have enough time when the product goes really into testing, the prototypes are ready. If you say that works for you, then fine. Then start, in the beginning with the iterative process. Start with like preparing documentation, collecting input, and do the writing later. So I don't know, there's so many factors, and you always have to look at the whole setup individually.
Okay, so we have another, it's more of a comment, but I'll read it anyways. So for writing ahead, it seems the smart thing to do is to get really involved in the epic and story definition. So
Yeah.
you have workflows and conceptual content in place before you have to finish task content. Move towards documentation-driven design. And then I think you alluded to this idea in an earlier slide.
Yeah, that's right.
Agreed?
I totally agree.
Okay, the next one is a question. So small doc team was brought into the Scrum group 3 months ago, 3 months into development, and could never catch up. What are the biggest priorities if you start from behind in Agile?
I think your biggest priority in the beginning is to kind of, first of all, understand, as we just said, the big user stories, the big concepts, and what is it all about, and making a concept for what needs to be documented, I would say. And also documentation should then focus on, what is really relevant, and have a minimalistic approach there as well. So it might be a good idea to go about and screen the user stories for stuff that is relevant for documentation and stuff that is not relevant for documentation. Because in software development, I think three months is often nothing. And they do a lot of conceptual stuff at the beginning. They do the architecture of the system, and that's often something that is baked into the software but not really relevant for the user interface. So maybe the teams can help you there, and to go through the stuff and really flag user stories that are not relevant for documentation, and then you can focus on those that you've already picked from the epics where okay, this we need to document, and then you can focus on getting details about them. That'd be my idea.
Okay. I think that's it for questions, Marion. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really informative presentation, and a joy to have you on the air. So if anyone has questions, further questions about this, you can just send either myself or Marion an email, and we will get back to you right away. So thank you to all
Okay.
of you as well for joining us for episode 15. And if any of you would like to be featured in one of our future webinars, or you have a unique topic idea, you can get in touch with us at team.ccms@ixasoft.com. So we'll see you soon, and thank you so much, Marion.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Bye.
Bye-bye.